Hello everyone and welcome to this online presentation which is all about looking at the future, and I've called it Future Focus because I'm going to take you through this process called scenario planning, which is all about leading in uncertainty. And this presentation is brought to you by the Governance Institute of Australia, and I love working with people who are senior leaders, who are on boards, who are working with the strategic planning for the future. And so today I'm going to share with you some ideas around strategic planning and thinking in this area, in this time of real uncertainty. And it doesn't matter whether you're involved in a board or not. I know many people here are. And so welcome to the members of the Governance Institute, but there are others here as well. And if you've got any sort of leadership position, then I think you'll find this useful, because for all of us, we've got to step up and be leaders here in this time. And so, one of the things that happens when we've got all this uncertainty is you really have to think about risk when you're making decisions. And to their credit, governance organizations around the world have really stepped up at the time this pandemic hit, and they've provided a lot of resources for people who are making important decisions and for evaluating risks. So places like Harvard and a whole bunch of other organizations were talking about how to manage governance in this COVID-19 pandemic disrupted era. And with all due respect to those organizations, what I'm going to talk about here is something different, because most of them talk about how you really need to focus and have a laser-like focus on the responsibilities that you have as a senior leadership team or as a board or to your investors. But I want to talk about something a little bit different. And I want to talk about going wider, because I think it's more important now than ever before to think wide, not just think deep. So you'll understand what I mean when we get a little bit further into this presentation. My name's Gihan Pereira. I'm a futurist, so I help people look at trends, and I also help people deal with uncertainty and deal with disruption and change and things that are happening outside their organization, their team, even outside their community. So I work with a number of organizations around Australia and New Zealand. I've just got a sample here of the organizations I've worked with at a leadership level, and you can see it's everywhere. There's government at all levels, there's not-for-profits, there's private organizations which are large multinationals, some of them are local. And the thing is that many of us are facing the same issues. And, you're probably sick of hearing people say we're living in unprecedented times, and it's true, but it's only unprecedented because it's happening to everybody at the same time. And over the last 5 to 10 years, I've worked with a lot of organizations and industries that have also been going through massive change and disruption, not due to a pandemic, but due to other factors. And so it's unprecedented now because it's happening to everybody. But you know what? This has happened before, and it's going to happen again. It's just now happening all at the same time. So some of the strategies that businesses have been using and organizations have been using are still going to work now. They're just being used in a different context. So my rules of engagement for all my presentations, I've got 3 basic rules. So one of them is to think. So I want to give you some opportunities to think during this time. So try to do everything you can to block out other distractions during this time that we've got together. I'd also like you to be a bit playful. So I've got some exercises and some things to do. I'm going to ask you questions through this. I'm going to ask you to engage in the chat room. I'll say that if you're engaging in the chat, you'll see there's 2 options. It says panelists or panelists and attendees. When you engage, can I ask that you use the panelists and attendees, because that means everybody gets to see the benefits of what you're writing. If you just say panelists, it only comes to me. Okay, so be a bit playful, but also I really do want to give you some practical things that you can take away and put back in your workplace, on your board, in your community, with your team. I run a program called Futuristic Residence, which is where I go into organizations, and sometimes the full version of this is I run it over a year, and I drop into board meetings or senior leadership meetings once every 3 months. So kind of like an external advisor to the board. Sometimes it's just a single session. So some of the ideas I'm going to share with you today are from that program. So these are things that I've used, and I've worked with leaders in organizations around the world, but mostly around Australia. And so I won't go through them in detail because obviously we haven't got the time for that, but I want to give you enough that you can take this away and use it, whether or not you engage me for the Futuristic Residence program. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to make this interactive. So here's my first piece of interaction for you. Let me ask you this. In the chat room, What is this? Does anyone recognize it? Can you type in the chat room what you think this is? I reckon some people will get it pretty easy. Oh, yeah, look, got it straight away. So the first one is Pong. Yeah, okay, so Pong. So this is what computer games looked like when I was growing up. Now this is my stepson Josh. He's the one on the left there. And computer games have changed a lot. And this is what computer games look like now on his Xbox. And the thing is, there are a lot of people, especially leaders, who are still Pong thinkers in an Xbox world. And it's not because we've got dumber or our thinking is, because we've got older, we've become dumber as a result of it. It's not that. It's just that our world has changed around us, and some of the things that used to work for us in the past might not serve us well now. Some of it does, but some of it doesn't. So this is why we need to think differently now. And especially if you're a leader, if you have a lot of experience, just be careful, because sometimes an experience works for you, sometimes it doesn't. And let me ask you another piece of interaction here. Let me ask you about these four companies. And I'm going to give you these four logos here, and I'm going to ask you what these four companies have in common. So the first one's Groupon, which is like a deal site, a coupon advertising promotional site. In Australia, Coupon's the one that's more popular, but Groupon kind of started that trend. Slack, online collaboration tool, supposed to replace the email a few years ago, was one of the fastest growing companies in the world. Uber, which we all know for ride sharing and other services, and WhatsApp, which is a messaging and chat system. So in the chat, can you just type in what you think those four companies have in common? And there's actually a number of answers to this and a number of correct answers. There's one specifically I'm looking for, and sometimes people get it. As I can see here, digital, there's disruptors. I was speaking to a leadership team last week, and one of the leaders there, she said, these are all things that my Gen Z kids can't live without. So, there's many answers. Carly has got Carly Yvette, yeah, a few here. Um, have got the answer that I was looking for, the specific answer that I was looking for, which is that all of these companies were created during the GFC, during the global financial crisis. Now, in Australia, of course, we were affected by the GFC, but not as much as Asia, North America, and Europe. And all of these companies were founded during the GFC. Now, the reason I'm sharing this with you is not to go, rah, rah, motivational speaker, if they can do it, you can, every crisis is an opportunity. That's not why I'm doing that. The reason I'm sharing this with you is it's a bit of a warning that sometimes disruption, external disruption, makes it easier for innovators and competitors to come into your space. And this is what happened with these companies, because customers are looking for different things, employees are looking for different things, investors are looking for different things when there's already disruption in the world. This is why if you get a stone that hits your windscreen when you're driving, you should get it fixed straight away, because it might crack the windscreen, but that's not the real danger. The real danger is the second stone that hits it that's going to shatter it, because the first crack has made it vulnerable. And so it's like that now, that we have been disrupted from outside by this coronavirus and COVID-19 disease that's spreading through the world, and that's making things vulnerable. So people are looking around for new solutions, and it's actually easier for disruptors to come in. So even if you think that your business or your industry hasn't been affected a lot by the pandemic, just keep in mind that some of these things are changing. Here's a photograph. I shared this in a newsletter on LinkedIn recently. This is a photograph I took a few years ago when I was walking through Sydney Airport, the Qantas terminal. They had this advertising banner, and if you can't read the details, it's advertising GoToMeeting. So this is before Zoom became really popular. But as I was walking through the terminal, I took a photo of this because I thought, isn't that interesting that Qantas is allowing advertising from one of their biggest competitors? And that's interesting. Now, obviously, if you saw a Virgin ad in the Qantas terminal, you say they'd never do that, because they wouldn't do that. But Qantas doesn't see GoToMeeting and Zoom and WebEx and Microsoft Teams as a competitor. And yet, a big part of their business, a big part of their revenue is getting business people who live a long way apart together for meetings. And isn't that exactly what GoToMeeting and all these other online collaboration tools do? And I've shared this with clients, I've shared this with audiences, and most of the response I get is, yeah, that's kind of interesting, but probably not that important for Qantas, because what could possibly happen that could mean that we'd all stop traveling and want to do online meetings, right? So they saw that as a minor a minor problem and not anywhere near as big as, say, advertising, which like their traditional competitors, other airlines. And yet, this is one of the things that's happened. So disruption does create these opportunities. So as we go through, as we talk through for the next 50 minutes or so, we're looking at the future, and you might walk out of this presentation with more questions than answers. And that's a good thing. So what I want to do is get you to ask some different questions rather than give you lots and lots of answers. I really want to open your thinking and broaden your thinking so you can deal better with your teams, with your senior leaders, with your board, and so on, and with investors and customers as well. So as we go through this, be prepared for me to ask you questions and for you to walk out with some new questions that you can ask to help with your planning. Okay, more interaction. So I've got a puzzle for you here. So this puzzle is with cards, and you can see the cards there. I need to explain what these cards are. So all 4 cards have a picture on the front. So you can see there's a fish and a dragon, and all 4 cards have a solid color on the back. So you can see a red and a yellow. And I'm going to make this statement that every red-backed card has a dragon on the front. And I wonder whether that statement's true or false. Now, I'm not going to ask you to type in the chat box whether it's true or false, because some of you have already figured that you actually don't know. You don't know the answer. You don't have enough information yet to be able to tell me whether every red-backed card has a dragon on the front. You need to turn over some of the cards. Obviously, you could turn them all over, and then you'd know for sure, but you don't need to turn them all over. So what I'd really like you to do is to type in the chat box which cards you must turn over to be able to tell me for sure whether that statement is true or false. So what's the minimum number of cards and what are the cards? If you think you need to turn them all over, type in 1, 2, 3, 4. If I told you don't need to do that. If you think it's just 1 and 4, type in 1, 4. If you think it's 2 and 3, type in 2, 3. Any combination you can type in, and let's see what people are saying. Okay, I haven't seen the right answer yet. I have seen the right answer now. Okay, as far as I can see, I think one person, I can see all these coming through. 2 people I can see so far have got the right answer. Okay, good, good. Okay, third one. Great, Samantha, you know that you've got here the third person. I have the other names have skipped past. So let me show you the answer here, right? So there are 2 easy answers to this. So there are 2 easy cards that most people get. So obviously you need to turn over card number 1 to see whether there's a dragon on the other side. And you don't need to turn over card number 3 because it's got a yellow back. It doesn't matter what's on the other side. You also don't need to turn over number 4 because if it's got a red back, then it doesn't give you any extra information. And if it has any other color back, like a yellow or a blue or a black, then it becomes irrelevant, like number 3. So you do need to turn over number 2 because you want to see whether it's got a red on the back, because then the statement's false. Okay, so the answer is you need to turn over 1 and 2. And when I do this with groups, when I do this with large audiences, with hundreds of people, at the end of it, I say, who got the right answer? And maybe a handful of people would say, yes, I got the right answer, would get the right answer. And the reason for that is because most people get 1, but they don't get 2. Because on 2, there's no red, there's no back, and there's no dragon. And I think when we're looking at the future, we have got 2 kinds of futures just like this. So one is a future that we can see, and even if it's challenging, at least we know what we need to do to get there, and we can work towards it. The other one is a future that you can't see, and that one is a lot more uncomfortable for many people. That uncertainty causes problems. Not for everybody. I know some people who love it. They thrive in chaos because they see lots of opportunities in chaos, and they love that uncertainty. But many people don't. They don't like that uncertainty, and so that's a big challenge because we are facing a lot of uncertainty now. So let's do a poll. So I've got another little exercise for you to do here. This one's a poll. And the way the poll works is we won't do it using Zoom's polling. We'll actually use the poll that I've set up here. And I'm just going to share this in the chat room. So you can see I put a link in the chat room, t.ly/poll. You can either type that, you can click it in the chat if it's clickable, or you can type that into your web browser and you'll go to the polling window. And when you go to the polling window, you'll see it will look something like this. So this will be coming up for you to vote. And what I've got for you are 4 questions, and we're going to select in 4 polls in one go. There's a chance for you to answer all 4 of them together. And you can see the 4 questions. The first 2 are about you. The next 2 are about your board. The questions are, do you operate well when there's a certain future, even if it's challenging? Do you operate well in uncertainty? And the same 2 questions for your board, or your leadership team, or your team, or wherever you're working. It could be your community. Okay, let's see what people are saying. Okay, this is interesting. It's a little bit different than some of the responses I've had at other times when I've run this poll. So, okay, I'll explain what I mean. Okay, so the numbers are more normal now to what I've seen in the past. Okay, so Brenda, I think you need to just put that link into your web browser and then you'll be able to do the poll. Okay, I'll leave it open for another 5 seconds for other people to respond, since it seems to have stabilized now. Yeah, okay, so this is not surprising. So this is quite common. So when I run this poll with even with senior leadership teams and with a number of organizations, what I'm finding is that most people, typically, you see the answers to questions 1 and 2, they're more comfortable dealing with certainty than uncertainty. And typically their teams or their boards are again the same. There's a discrepancy between them. Often I see that there's a bigger gap between the first question and the third one, the blue and the yellow, the red one there. So most people, they think that their teams, the second and the fourth, they think that their teams are really bad at dealing with uncertainty, even if they themselves are reasonably good at it. But you can see here that most people are saying that it's easier, even if you've got a challenging future, we'd rather that than have an uncertain future that we have to work through. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? So as I said to you, my promise to you is that I want to share with you an idea around scenario planning. So broadly, I want to talk about 3 things today. So I want to talk about, first of all, what's your platform for planning? This will get you ready for this scenario planning exercise. And then the platform, you'll understand what I mean when we get into that. Then we'll talk about, give you an overview of building a plan. I'll give you enough that you can take it away and use with your board or with your leadership team. And then I also want to talk about this idea that I alluded to at the start, which is getting a broader perspective and thinking wider, not just deeper. But one thing around all of this, before we get into these 3 things in detail, is just to keep in mind that all the planning you're doing now is not going to be perfect. So whatever we do is not going to be set in stone. So if you think metaphorically that the planning you did when the crisis hit, and as you come into recovery, you may have had to throw out your plans. It might have been like a little kid's drawing. But what you're aiming for is you're not aiming to create a masterpiece. What you're looking for is something in the middle, but with enough flexibility that you can switch to, you've got a plan A, you can switch to plan B or plan C if you need to do that. Okay, so that's what we're looking for here. You're not going to get the full plan out of this session. Even when you go away and do your planning, scenario planning will help you have multiple scenarios that you can work with. Okay, so let me explain what I mean by your platform for planning. So I'm going to get you to do a poll, but the poll is going to be based on 4 words that you can see here on this slide. So I'm going to ask you, is your planning reactive, responsive, proactive, or disruptive? Now, obviously, you know what those words mean, but maybe not in this context. So let me give you a little bit of background, and then we'll run the poll. So there's been a lot of research done into what leaders are looking for, what they're worried about. KPMG did some research recently. In fact, they've done this survey for the last 3 years, and they asked Australian CEOs at the start of each year, what are the biggest things on your radar? What are the things that you're most concerned about? And they identified the top 10 things. I'm not going to give you all 10 of them. If you want, you can go and download the report. You just do Google search for it. KPMG keeping us up at night. And they've done this for the last 3 years. The most recent one was done at the start of the year before the pandemic. And the top 3 things that came up from Australian CEOs was number 1, digital transformation. Number 2, global and politics and economics, and number 3, regulation. So this is across a broad range of industries. Obviously, it's going to vary by industry. Now, what's happened now, and this is just one example, is that COVID-19 has accelerated digital transformation, especially for offices, for office workers who had to work from home for their own safety and security. Many were doing that for the first time. And so it's really been transformed, and everyone had to scramble to make that work as a result of COVID-19. And so there's a lot of conversation happening now about what's the office of the future going to look like, as people are going to think about where are they going to work. So I just want to expand your thinking around that just a little bit. So when we think about the post-pandemic office, it's not only about where people work, but it's also going to be about when do they work and who's going to be in your team. And all of these things come out of this transformation that's happened with people having to scramble to work from home. So let me just tell you briefly. I run a whole workshop on this. I help HR and leadership teams about this. We can go into a lot of depth, but let me tell you briefly what I mean by where, when, and how. So a workplace of the future doesn't only have to be the office. Obviously, a lot of people are talking about working from home, but in the future, we'll be going and working in cafes again, in airline lounges, in co-working spaces, in serviced offices, maybe even working illegally while driving. But why does it have to be illegal? In the future, when we have self-driving cars, one of your workplaces might be the car when you're working, because your car is doing the driving for you. And this is not in the long-term future. The self-driving car is still way away. But just last week, Siemens, which is also one of my clients, multinational company, and they have now started a rule for all their staff around the world that they can work 1, 2, or 3 days a week away from an office. So for many of them, it's going to be working from home, but they're now allowing work from anywhere. So that's when. The when is like what the working hours mean, when you don't have that Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 commuting to the CBD. Microsoft Japan experimented with this. Again, this is pre-pandemic. They were a little bit ahead of their time, and they allowed their sales staff to do a 4-day week. And they didn't have to work extra on those days to make up the time. They just worked a 4-day week. And they found not only did productivity not go down, it went up. Performance went up, sales went up by 40%. Two of the things that they found worked for them, they limited meetings to 30 minutes, maximum length of a meeting, because we hadn't got time to mess around, and they had more online meetings. So this is just another example of where we can say, as a result of making this change to the workplace, maybe it's going to change when people work as well. And obviously the last thing is, who does the work for you? So I live in the world's most beautiful city. I'm biased, but I think that in Perth. But it doesn't have to be, your team doesn't have to be only the people who are within easy commuting distance of your office. It can be people in other cities. It can be people in the regions, because now there are people who are making a sea change, a tree change. Even now, they're starting to see a COVID change out to the regions. And of course, there are smart people in the regions who, for whatever reason, decided that they don't want to live in the big smoke. There's a bit of a myth in Australia that all people from the country are moving to the cities and everyone's leaving the regions behind. It's not true. Actually, in the last 5 years, net migration is going in the other direction. And there are more people moving to the regions. So there's no reason why you can't have a national team. And of course, there's no reason why you can't have an international team either, a really global team. In the future, the biggest barrier might not be distance, it might be time zone to decide who's on your team. And you can also bring in people from outside. And outside doesn't mean completely outside. It could be, but it could also be people in your organization who live on the other side of the world, but you bring them in for a Zoom meeting or a short consulting session, or they join your team for a week, but living where they are. So this has been happening for decades. It just hasn't been mainstream for many organizations until now. And the last one about who's in your team is this idea of lost talents, quite often forgotten. An example, smart, savvy professional women who opt out of the workforce for a couple of years to have kids. They come back from the maternity leave, but they don't necessarily want to come back 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, 5 days a week. They might want to work a few days a week during school hours, and that talent might have been lost if you're insisting that they come into an office. So there's some real opportunities here in who's in your team, and people are just being creative about it. Just one example from personal experience. In the last few months, I've been doing some work with an organization in Townsville. And so the CEO of that organization brought me in. They were doing their 5-year strategic plan. And in June, which is just last month, we did they were doing their strategic planning session, and she brought me at the start to give people a futuristic view of their industry. But she didn't stop there. She said, as part of this engagement, why don't you drop in to our meetings? So they're doing a town hall meeting every month, and drop in and do a little mini presentation at each of those meetings. And again, this is something that we would not have even considered, for me to fly from Perth to Townsville every month, pandemic or not. But because she was willing to think creatively, it created opportunities like this. Okay, so the idea is that as a result of people working from home, we've now got this concept of fluid teams. It's not just about where people work, but it could also be when people work and who's in a team. I do want to quickly stop and just check if there's any questions or comments about that. As I say, this is it's a huge topic, and I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but I can see, yeah, Caroline Thompson said, yeah, older workers are often missed as a skill source. Also, people with some disabilities who, for them, it's difficult to work and to commute and to work a 40-hour week in the city. Again, smart people that you might be missing out on, people who relocate, or who move, or you lose them because their partner relocates. So you lose them, but now they can be part of your team. There's a whole bunch of lost talent out there. Okay, good. Okay, I don't see any. Yeah, so Nick's asking about people will return to office-based work. Yeah, and I think people will, but actually, Nick, that actually leads me very nicely into my next point here, because this is exactly what I want to talk about. And again, this is an example of, remember, way back like 5 minutes ago, what's your planning platform? This is what I want to talk about. So what happens in a crisis is people go through these 3 stages of managing the crisis. So what happens is internally and externally. So, and this is curve, and you hear people talking about the U curve, the V curve, the W curve, and so on. Here's the simplest version of that. So initially there's a crisis, then there's a recovery, which usually takes longer than the crisis. And then people feel like we're back to where we were, and then we can start thinking about growth. So when there's a crisis, everybody becomes reactive. You put aside your long-term plans and just do whatever you need to do to keep your head above water. And then as recovery happens, good organizations start being responsive. They start looking ahead, but possibly only in the short term. And then once they've got back to where they were, they're proactive. So then they start thinking about growth. That's what good organizations do. Better organizations start being proactive, and they start thinking about growth. They start thinking ahead, even now, even while they're getting through recovery. And some really forward-thinking organizations say, let's forget about following that path. Let's be disruptive. So let me give you an example of that. And again, I'm going to use a workplace example because we've just been talking about that. And let me show you what that means. And I think this will also answer your question, Nick, when you're talking about what's going to happen with office-based work. So you can see this little diagram here. Let me talk you through this. So in a crisis, let's look at this workplace. What happened was, in the crisis, everyone was reactive, and they said, we need to work from home. And then as recovery started, it's happening in different rates, in different countries, and even different states in Australia, we had this return to office strategy. And then people, I think, when they get back into the office, they think, oh, things are back to normal again, even if it's a different kind of normal. Let's not think about work from anywhere. And you think about things like co-working spaces and airline lounges and things. And it's quite normal, and it's quite okay for organizations to go through this 3-phase strategy. We've been work from home, we now return to office, now let's go to working from anywhere. Okay, and that's good. And some people, as I said, some people are being proactive, and they're doing the working from anywhere strategy, even while they're being responsive. But the most disruptive organizations, and I'm lucky I've got a few clients like this, who are already thinking, what is it going to mean if we have this idea of these fluid teams? We don't need to move back into the office to be able to start thinking about that. Let's start thinking about that now. So how can we be a fluid team even now, even before we get back into the office and before we're through this pandemic and social distancing? Let's start thinking ahead. And now that the pandemic has disrupted our workplace, how can we disrupt ourselves? And that's what I mean by being disruptive here. So when we do the poll in a sec, it's not about necessarily disrupting your industry. It's actually disruptive thinking around your own business, your own organization. Okay, so let me see. Okay. Yeah, Wendy calls it virtual teams. So I won't go into this because into much detail here because I don't like the term virtual. I prefer distributed teams. Um, okay, I see comments coming in. So let me just see what people are saying. Collaboration with external organization is transforming. Absolutely. So when I work with people, with organizations about looking at markets, I say, who are your competitors? And then how can you partner with them? Because one of the best things you can do now is partner. And I've got a few clients who are doing that already very successfully, competitors who wouldn't do that otherwise. Um, what do we need to do to get the top CEOs thinking about people-related issues? Absolutely a huge area, and I do a lot of work around reimagining the workplace and the future of talent. So that's another whole topic. Uh, yeah, okay, good. So let me go to this poll. So this poll here, if you had the polling window open before, I just need to move it forward to the next poll question. So if you were already on the polling window, then you can just do it straight away. If you weren't, let me paste the poll link in there again for you, and you can vote in this poll. Okay, so this poll is just asking you in very, very basic and very broad terms, when you're thinking about planning for the future, it doesn't only have to be about people talent planning. Where are you? Are you reactive? Are you responsive? Just thinking about recovery, but still short term. Are you already proactively thinking about growth? Or it's good to see that. So this group is a bit self-selecting. People who come to these presentations, and I usually find about 15% are saying they're disruptive. So we're almost at that 10 to 15%. And the thing is that if you're still in that crisis mode, then yeah, that all of this long-term planning may not be right for you. You might be starting to think responsibly, but if you're really in crisis, then now is the time to get out of the crisis first before you look further. Okay, good. Lots of people responding. Yeah, so this is typical, right? So actually, there are more people saying proactive now, which is great. It's really good to see that. And the people I work with, again, the people who call me typically tend to be the people who say, let's think about growth. One of my clients, in fact, he said, as his senior leaders were thinking about getting back into the office, he said, Kihan, my leaders are only thinking about how do we return to the office. I want them to think bigger. I want them to think further, not just about the workplace, but about our business for the next 5 to 10 years. So we worked with his team so that they started thinking proactively and disruptively. And he's actually decided that he's going to set up a little disruption team within his leadership team to actually think about how can we disrupt what we're doing rather than going step by step as an evolution. Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks everyone for sharing that. Yeah, interesting. This is actually the highest I've seen, 50% almost, saying that they're proactively thinking about growth. Fantastic. It's really good to see because I think that if you're not in crisis, and I totally get if you're in crisis, then you need to manage the crisis. But if you're not in crisis, I reckon now's the time to be thinking proactively, or even better, thinking disruptively. Okay, so let's go to this next area here because this is the area where I want to give you now that you know your platform. We're going to talk about scenario planning, and I have spent quite a bit of time on platform only because whether you're reactive, proactive, or disruptive is going to have a huge impact on how you're going to do this next stage, which is the scenario planning. One of my favorite quotations is from Tolkien and from The Hobbit, and he says this, that if you've got a live dragon living somewhere near you and you're doing your strategic planning, it's a pretty good idea to include him in your plans. I paraphrased a bit, but you get the idea, right? And this was happening now. We've got these live dragons, and some of them we know about, some of them you may not have thought of. And this process of scenario planning helps you think about some of the other dragons that might be lurking around the corner. So scenario planning, it seems to have its roots back in the 1970s with Shell. So Shell got a bunch of guys, literally 3 guys, and put them in a room, and they said, we're not sure what's going to happen in the future, so can you do some research into what the future is going to look like, and then come and tell us. So these 3 guys looked at multiple different scenarios. They had to look at things like at the time, what if Jimmy Carter becomes president? What if there's war in the Middle East? What if OPEC countries can constrain the supply of oil? They came up with all these scenarios. They looked at how plausible they would be. They took them back to senior management, and management said, great, this looks fantastic. Which of them is going to happen? And they said, no, that's not the way this works. we've given you some different scenarios. We've told you how likely some of them are. Now, build some plans, but have some backup plans. And that's what scenario planning is all about, having multiple scenarios. And you choose the plausible scenarios, and sometimes you might choose some way out scenarios. And then have a plan A, and then have a plan B and a C. And you can go to D, E, and F, but for most organizations, having 3 or 4 scenarios is good enough. One of the really useful tools you can use for scenario planning is a tool called pestle analysis. You may not have heard it, but you may have heard of STEEP analysis. So PESTLE and STEEP are both acronyms. PESTLE's got one more letter, so it's like the more advanced version. So if you hear somebody say, oh, let's do a STEEP analysis, you go, oh no, you haven't said this, no, you should now do a PESTLE analysis. That's so much better. But actually it's the same kind of idea. There's just one other component to it. So and all it is just a quick way of you thinking about different domains. Okay, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So the way the pestle analysis works is there's 6 areas that you look at. So the first one is political. So what political things are happening that could affect our medium and long-term future, what's happening in the environment, so climate change, global pandemic, those are the sort of things that fit under environmental. Social, so this is about people, what's happening with people, and uncertainty about jobs, Gen Z's coming into the workplace, people connecting using social media. So that's all the social side of it. Technological, which tends to get a lot of the focus. And when I work with leadership groups, I say, don't only think about technology, but look at these other areas as well. But definitely technology is obviously a big factor. The L is for legal. So what's happening around the laws, around regulation, around high court challenges to border closures. What's that all going to mean in terms of our future? And the last one, the second E, is economics. So we're in a recession. What's that going to mean? What's that going to mean for customer sentiment? What's that going to mean for people and jobs, and so on? So this pestle analysis is something that's worth doing, and I do this. It usually takes quite a bit of time with the leadership team. All I want to give you is I just want to give you here just this one tool here. So we won't go through it in a lot of detail. So I'll pick one example. So let's pick environmental, because of course the pandemic is in everyone's lives at the moment, regardless of how your organization's been affected. And by the way, some people will say, oh, no, that's not environmental. Social. It doesn't matter what category we put these in. These are just ways to start your thinking. So don't get too, when you do this exercise, don't get too where things fit. So if you look at the pandemic, it's one thing that comes up in pestle analysis. You say Australia's strategy at the start of this process was to flank we make sure that the healthcare system doesn't get overwhelmed. And so that still is our strategy as a country. That's our strategy. But then you could say, what are the things that could happen in the future? And this is where you look at different scenarios. So you could say, what could happen? Well, you could globally, around the world, eradicate the virus. Solved. We could eliminate it locally, either as a country or, as we've done already successfully in many parts of Australia, eliminate it at a state and territory basis. We could find a vaccine, and that'll take some time to roll out, but not everyone needs to get vaccinated. You just need enough people so the virus can't spread. We could find a treatment for it, and there are already signs that there's some very positive signs about treatments. Or maybe the virus becomes endemic. It becomes like the cold and the flu, that it just leaves. We may have a season of COVID-19 every winter. And what about the scenario that everyone says in winter, look, COVID-19, we're all going to go back home, shut down our businesses, or at least kind of partial lockdown. That might seem unrealistic, but what we've been through in the last 4 months isn't any more unrealistic than that. Okay, so that's just one example. That's just one example of using this process of scenario planning to identify multiple scenarios. And when you do this process, you're going to end up with a whole bunch of scenarios. So how do you know which ones to focus on? So there's some specific things that you can do. And one of them is to look at what the research is saying. So there's a lot of research that's already coming out about how we manage our near-term future. And you've seen this. You may have seen some of this. It's across different industries as well as broad things. So this is one about HR being ready for a recession. This is one about Australian consumer sentiment and how we feel. This is about our labour market. There was a question about that earlier. So this is the sort of stuff that I this is my day job, to do all this research, to read it, to understand it, to filter it for the industries I work with. But most people don't have the luxury to do all of that, to say, what's the World Economic Forum saying about talent for the next 5 years? So if you don't want to get all of this information, like obviously you can engage me to help you out, but if you don't want to get all of this information, spend all that time, one of the things that you can do to focus on which scenarios you're going to look at is to ask this question: what problem do you solve? So this is something that whenever I work with clients, I often come back to: what problem are you solving for your customers, your clients, investors, stakeholders? What problem are you solving? And this is really important. It sounds like such a simple question, but it's really important that we keep coming back to that question. And just keep in mind, as a result of any disruption, and in this case, coronavirus, that the problem that you solve for your customers might have changed. They might be going through a different journey now. Many organizations have done customer journey mapping. If you have, congratulations. Make sure you renew it and you do it again, because your customer's journey might have changed now. I'll give you one example, telehealth. So in healthcare, and I do quite a bit of work with healthcare, so telehealth is something that's happened and it's grown in popularity as a result of the pandemic. But this is something that's been around for a while. It's been around for decades. 5 years ago, I was speaking at one of Australia's largest private healthcare groups, speaking to their leaders about what their future might hold. I said, what about telehealth? This is something that's growing. It's already happening in Asia, and we're already having people who are doing medical tourism to Asia to get really complex operations and procedures done. And some of them had those interviews with their surgeons before they leave the country, because they're doing it through Skype. And I looked at the research. I actually put out some of my slides from their presentation 5 years ago, and I said already patients are happy to do this. They're already happy to get email and SMS consultations with their doctors. They're already happy that you get your images emailed to you, and then you ring up and have a phone conversation, or you have a video consultation, or you can choose your treatments online, not by looking at Dr. Google and then making an ill-informed choice, but in conjunction with your healthcare providers, can you do this? And so this was 5 years ago, and I also shared some research as to why this wasn't happening. This was in the US, and so that was Deloitte research. PwC also surveyed doctors at around the same time. They said, why aren't you doing it? And these were their responses. So 45% of them said, we're worried about privacy, security, confidentiality. Fair enough, but what about this? We don't get paid for it. So, and in Australia, until recently, it wasn't possible to bill for a telehealth consultation. There was no CMBS code for it, so for people in healthcare. They think it was too expensive to set up the technology to make that happen. Or they didn't know enough and it wasn't a priority, or it was too difficult to change the existing processes in their practices to allow telehealth. And suddenly, it has now become a priority. Okay, so that's what I mean by saying that your customer journey may have changed. And I know, talking to some people in healthcare, it's not only the telehealth consultations that have changed, but other areas have as well. I won't go into too much detail, but it's actually transforming other parts of healthcare as well. Okay, let me quickly check if there are any questions or comments about that before we go into the last one. Wendy, force analysis is another, I get that, and I don't want to go into too much detail into that area. As you can see, with this whole idea of this scenario planning, I'm trying to give you enough that you can go away and at least have a go at it, because having a go will be better than doing nothing and having only a plan A and then you're knocked aside when the next crisis occurs. But there's enough for you to go ahead and work with. But also have this last part to it. So add this bit of perspective. So what I want you to do is, rather than only thinking deep, think broad as well. I've got a prize to give away. So for the people who've stayed this long, I've got a prize to give away. Now, one person here is going to win a fabulous prize in the next few minutes. And the prize is my book, Disruption by Design. So one person here is going to get a copy of my book, Disruption by Design. And the way to get it, let me show the slide in full for you. So the way to get it is, I'm going to ask you 3 questions. Now, these are 3 maths questions, mathematics. So before you all cringe and go, I'm not good at maths, I can tell you that these are questions that primary school kids can answer. So I've got 3 questions, and you just got to answer them quickly. So the first person who types in all 3 correct answers in the chat box will get the prize. So there's 3 questions. The 3 answers are pretty simple. Just type them all on the same line. So don't type 3 separate responses because then I won't be able to see as things are scrolling by. So the questions are pretty easy. 3 simple maths questions. The world record for this, by the way, so when I've done this with groups, the world record for this is 24 seconds. So for someone to get the right answer. Interestingly, women seem to do better than men at this. Why? But we'll see how we go. Okay, ready? 3 questions coming up on the screen now. All right, so I'm just having a look at the chat room to see whether people are responding. If you don't know all 3 answers, just type in the ones that you know. There may be no one who gets all 3. I think there's someone who's got 2 of the answers. Okay, so within the group, I can see all 3 answers. Great. Okay, I can see at least one person who's got all 3. I see Glenn Diamond's got all 3, but maybe some others have as well. Good, thank you for doing that. Yep, Trevor's got all 3 as well. Okay, so let me get to that. Let me show you the answers. So I'm sure that some people would have got at least one of these 3 answers. Okay, now if you got at least one of these 3 answers, bummer, because all those 3 answers are wrong. So let me go to the correct answer. So the correct answer for the first one, the bat and the ball together cost $11. So the ball costs 50 cents because that's the only way to make it work. It doesn't cost $1 because otherwise it would only be $9 more. 5 men can paint 5 walls in 5 minutes. So it takes 5 minutes to paint a wall. So 10 men, 10 walls. Again, 5 minutes. And the fish weighs 500 grams plus half. It's not half of 500, but the 500 was the half. So the fish weighs 1 kilogram in total. Okay, so why am I doing this? So the thing is this, that we're all really good at pattern matching, and the more experienced you are, the more that your expertise and experience has built up your skill in pattern matching. So as a leader, as a director, somebody with a lot of experience, you might make decisions and people go, wow, how do you think of that so quickly? And it's because you've had that experience in the past, and it's helped build up this almost an intuition. The problem is sometimes that pattern matching leads you astray. And I said that primary school kids could do these questions, and it's true. Sometimes primary school kids would get more correct answers, or more of them would get the correct answers because they have to actually do the calculation. They don't automatically go to the right answer. Now, I did this in a really unfair way in the way that I set this up. So you notice that I said I made it really competitive. I said there's 24-second world records. So some people are competitive that way. I said women do better at men than this, and that's true. I just made that up. But again, add a little bit of competition to this because isn't this what happens in our lives all the time? We're asked to make decisions, and some of us have the tendency to go, quick decision is a good decision, and it's not always the way. So thank you for that. Just to finish off this exercise, for the people who got it right, congratulations. Thank you everyone for playing. I'm going to send everybody a copy of the book. I'll email it to you, or we'll email it to you at the end of the presentation. I've got this slide there that this is for the people who watch the recording. If you're watching the recording, then the way to get the book is to go to this website, gettotalk.at. It'll just ask you for a keyword, a password, type in the word disruption, and you'll get the book. If you're watching this live, don't need to do that. I'll send it to you afterwards. So here's the problem. The problem is that we have this knowledge, this expertise, this experience, which usually serves us well, but not always. As you can see, Josh Billings says here, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And that, when we're in times of change and uncertainty, that's really important to understand. So when we're talking about looking further and looking into the future, it's really good to double down on your expertise, to go deep. And we are where we got to because we've got deep expertise in our in our area of knowledge. But I also want you to think wider, and sometimes that means looking outside your industry. It's not even getting fresh thinking from inside your industry. It's sometimes even looking outside. The Institute for the Future, they identified 10 skills for the future workforce. You can download their report, Future Work Skills, from their website. It's easy to find. But I don't want to go through all of them, but I want to share one of them, which is the skill of transistor narrative, which is simply being a connector. So just looking at things from outside your discipline and saying, how could that apply to us? And again, I run whole workshops on this. I'm not going to run the workshop on teaching the skill. I'm going to give you 3 examples of how 3 businesses in 3 completely different industries have adapted, pivoted, if you like, through this pandemic. And I hope they give you some ideas. So you're going to get at least 2 ideas from outside your industry. One of them might actually be in your industry, but you might even get 3 ideas that you might be able to apply for your business and your industry. So the way to look at this is not to go, oh, that's okay, I'm not in real estate, so I don't need to worry about that. The way to go is, how can I use this? Or what's the analogy? What's the equivalent of that in my industry? Okay, so these are just 3 examples. One of my clients is a real estate agency in New Zealand, and as a result of them working from home, they've decided to go completely remote, so they don't have any fixed offices anymore. And so they have now produced these flyers that say we're going mobile, and they are sending out those flyers, dropping flyers and sending them out to clients, saying no more fixed office, we're going mobile. Now, isn't it true that most real estate agents will do that for you anyway? They'll come and visit you at your home. But this one, Maggie Dixon Real Estate in New Zealand, they decide to make a feature of it, and they decide to make it really prominent. So can you do something similar? At the Start Hotel in Sweden, so in Sweden, this hotel, like many in hospitality and accommodation, they went through they were really slammed by at the start of the pandemic, and they had lots of empty rooms. They had to lay off staff, and what they did was they looked at 2 things. They connected them. They said, 1, we have empty rooms, and 2, people are worried about eating out. So people were allowed to eat out, but they were worried about, obviously with social distancing, being close to people when they were eating out. So they said, how can we combine these things? And what they did, and what they're doing, is they're offering their hotel rooms as private dining suites. So if you want to eat out with your people in your household, then, but in safety, then you can hire one of those hotel rooms for 2.5 hours, and you can have a dining in that room in complete safety, because you've got all the social distancing that you need from the rest of the world. So this is somebody who said, we've got this resource, how can we use it in a different way to solve a problem that we weren't solving for customers before, but now we can solve it for them. The third example, Emirates, the airline industry, another one that was slammed by the pandemic. So Emirates just last week, and it might be a while before international travel comes back, but just last week they said, we're now going to provide health cover for anybody who flies with us. So we'll pay their expenses to make it easier for them to travel. In fact, they will pay up to €100 a night for up to 14 days for hotel quarantine. So if you're an Australian living overseas, you're coming back into Australia, and you know you've got to quarantine for 2 weeks, most of that is going to be paid for you if you fly with Emirates. Again, it's somebody who said, there seems to be this impenetrable barrier, but how can we remove that barrier? How can we reduce that? Again, an example for you to ponder for your own business, for your own industry. Okay, so we talked about these 3 things. We talked about you and your platform for planning. So are you going to be, if you're in crisis, it's okay to be reactive, but are you now going to be responsive, proactive, or disruptive? I've given you an overview of scenario planning, particularly with this idea around the pestle analysis. It's a useful exercise to do with your leaders, with your board. Just think about what future scenarios you might be facing, and then I really plead with you, implore with you to think wider and get that broader perspective. I just really quickly want to check if there's any last questions and comments. I see some brilliant thinking and interesting, and thank you, Greg, that's fantastic. So I've got one last little gem of an idea to share with you before we finish up. And so love the maturity of thinking in easy terms. Good, thank you. Thank you very much for that. Okay, so I don't see any other questions coming through. I want to share with you one last idea around decision making. So the brothers Chip and Dan Heath wrote the book Decisive, which is all about research-based strategies and how to make better decisions. And one of their strategies, which I'm going to share with you, is about getting some distance. And I've kind of adapted that to this idea of taking a future perspective. And if you want to know what the future is going to be like, well, who should you ask? Well, first of all, you should ask a futurist, but also maybe you should ask a time traveler. So somebody in the future could tell you this is what the future is going to be like. Mind you, if a time traveler from 2030 came back and said this is what 2020 is going to be like, you might not have believed them. But a useful exercise you can do is to be an imaginary time traveler. And the way it works is this: you think about now, and then you look at short term, medium term, and long term. So I'm going to use the numbers 10 weeks, 10 months, 10 years. You could use different numbers at different time frames. And what you do is, in your imagination, step into these future stages. So you do this for yourself, you do this with your team, you do this with your board, and say, imagine us at that time. So let's say 10 months from now, imagine the future you looking back at you now and saying, thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm so grateful for the decisions you made and the actions you took back then that have got us to where we are now. And that perspective might be just the thing you know, just the thing you need to get started. It doesn't mean you know the whole path, but at least you know the next action. As my did then what I knew how to do, now that I know better, I do better. And that's really the last message I want to leave you with. Don't wait to take action because you don't know what your future holds, because none of us really knows what our future holds. But take action now so that you can get better and then make better decisions in the future. If you would like to engage with me, please do. As I said, I run this program called Futuristic Residence, which has been more in demand now than it has been in the past. But I work with, facilitate senior leadership teams, run workshops for your team leaders, even work with people in your organization just to get them clearer about and more confident about working in uncertainty. So if you're interested, get in touch with me. You've seen my website, gihanperera.com, plastered throughout this presentation. All my contact details are there. I'd love to have a conversation with you about where you're going in the future. Thanks very much. Stay safe and healthy, and I'll see you in the future. Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.